Okay, here we go. All right. All right. So here today we're here to talk about Generation Z. My name is Kiri Via. I am one of the counselors here through Counseling Services. I am a licensed professional counselor. I've been working here at ASU, this will be my third academic year here. Prior to that, I worked at Rivercrest for 5 years in the acute care setting. So I have different experiences with all of this, but today our main focus is on Generation Z. We're going to be going over what we need to know about them and what COVID, the pandemic, did and what impact it had on this generation in particular. So first off, just going to go over the learning objectives again in a little bit more detail. We're going to go over the general characteristics and the events that shape this generation's view of the world. We're going to see how they view higher education, what potential issues in the classroom may look like, and what they want from a career. And then lastly, like I said, how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted this generation and what we can do to support them. And I'm going to let you know it is going to be a little bit of an information dump on some of this, mainly just because we have so much ground to cover. That's partially my fault for trying to want to cover as much in a short amount of time. But like I said, this is being recorded, so if you do happen to miss anything, we are going to be uploading this to our YouTube account that you can reference later if you do happen to miss anything. All right, so we're going to start off with just kind of an overview, why it's important to know generational information, why we need to know about them. So knowing the generational profile of workers, anticipating the needs and values of the next generation that will enter the market in the coming years is an important step to increase productivity and business success and avoid intergenerational conflicts. I mean, college, that's basically what we're here to do. We're here to help them succeed as best we can. This is very much focused on business, but also has a lot to do with the educational system as well. So just going over some brief characteristics. First off, when I say Generation Z, we're talking about people who and students who were born in 1995 to 2010. Now in generational theory as a whole, there is kind of, there's different time frames that you will see. Most of them range from the mid 90s to the mid 2000s on what they consider Generation Z, but 1995 through 2010 is the most commonly used. So that means the oldest parts of this generation are 25 years old, and then the youngest parts of them are 10. So for the next 10 years, we're going to see people from this generation. Now, these are all the different names for Generation Z. The top two of the asterisks are the ones you're going to see the most, but I think it's important to know about all these different particular names because it does give some insight into the characteristics we'll go over in a little bit. So we've got digital natives, iGen, two different iGens. So you got a small I and a big I. You got Delta, you got Gen Tech, you got NetGen, Post Millennials, Plurals, Generation We, and Post, Gen, and Gen Wi-Fi. I'm sure you're probably noticing some trends and some themes in a lot of these names, and it'll make a lot of sense in just a little bit. So shaping events. So there's probably about 5 main categories of events that shaped this generation's worldview. The first one in the top is ground zero from 9/11. Most of this generation was either born right around 9/11 or after it happened. So they understand the importance of 9/11, but they don't really have the experience of everything that happened prior to that. And also this exposed them to trauma and international terrorism because we haven't really been out of war as a whole since then. And so they've always been exposed to this. At the bottom, you recognize a smartphone anywhere. The first smartphone started in 95. The internet's been around for a lot longer, but the internet as we know it today has been around since the 90s. And most of the information on the internet has come in the past like 10 years. So this is a generation that has always had um, access to means of resources. So 24/7, they have had access of the ability to look up any kind of answer to any question they could ever have in different forms. Now the middle one here is a little boy who's sitting there studying, and this is to represent the No Child Left Behind Act. Now this has a big impact on learning as a whole and how these students do learn, because as it did help being able to get more services for at-risk youth, it did kind of tailor learning towards learning for an exam. And so it education wasn't really available as much to explore options. It was more about you need to pass the exam and then tailoring how you learn so that you can pass the exam. And so they struggle sometimes with understanding certain concepts if it doesn't necessarily apply to an exam. Um, the top picture on the other side with the money and the black arrow, that is to represent the recession in the early 90s. That has had a big impact on their family life. Either their parents lost jobs or they had to work double jobs because of that, or it dropped them in their socioeconomic status. And so people, these students have you'll see throughout the characteristics that the recession has had a big impact on them and how they view money, how they view their careers, and how they view taking risk in general. Lastly, we have the school desk. That is to represent school shootings and school shooting drills that are now a part of everyday life of schools. And so just as much as they were impacted by seeing war and terrorism, they are also now impacted by seeing trauma on a daily basis and being exposed to violence and natural disasters and those kind of things, whether it actually happened at their school in general or they just have access to it on their phone because they're getting constant updates about everything that's going on all over the world. So some words to describe Generation Z. First one, risk adverse. They do not like to take risk. And I'm going to preface all of this with that not every student is going to fit this category. There are plenty of people who are part of Generation Z, but actually share characteristics of different generations. So this is not going to describe every single student, but it may shed some light onto why some students act differently, and maybe as a whole, why certain classes that are coming in are asking either certain questions or you're seeing a trend in certain things. But one of the main ones you'll see is risk adverse. This generation is obsessed with safety. Um, they, like I said, they've been exposed to all of these things and they feel very uncomfortable with failure, whether it's academically, in their social lives, anywhere. Failure is not something they are ever comfortable with, nor are any of us. But usually at this age, they've had some experience with it, where this generation has had less of it than previous generations. They are also social justice advocates. That is a big portion of their identity as a whole. They reject social taboos. They want to rebuild systems that marginalize and oppress populations. And this is also like the most ethnically diverse generation to date. And so they want to see diversity in a way that is more open and less stigmatized. The third point, financially conservative. This is where recession kind of kicks in. They are very financially conservative. You will probably have this generation ask you more questions about money than you probably had from previous generations. They are very concerned about student debt, where their money is going, how their money is being spent. And a lot of that has to do with the previous generations, with millennials being very optimistic and a little bit flamboyant with their money, and not paying attention as much to the world as a whole. And this generation has a little bit more of a realistic, practical look at, especially their finances, but how they look at a lot of things. This fourth one might be a little controversial, but they are tolerant, and it's not tolerant based off of obedience. It's tolerant of people's differences. If you look back and remember back to some of the terms, one of the terms on there is plurals, which comes from the gender fluidity, um, sexuality, and all of those kinds of things, and those differences there, and being tolerant of those differences and opening and accepting of those differences is a really big classic hallmark of this generation, that they are very open to people being different and expressing who they are, and they have a hard time with um, systems that don't allow for people to do that and be able to express themselves. They're also very we centered. They have a view that they can change the world, and they have plans, many plans to do that, going back to that social justice aspect of things. Um, but they feel like they are the generation to save us all, and they feel like they have to do it. And they need our help, but they feel like they have to kind of push for these kinds of things. Second to last, they are entrepreneurial. They do want to own their own businesses, but it's also a little bit more than that. They've seen millennials make money through unconventional means by being influencers and through YouTube, and those kinds of things. And so they see that they have different avenues of doing the things they want to do, and they want to have a really big impact on the world as a whole. And so they want to figure out ways that they can do that. And so it's not just that they want to own their own business, it's a much broader picture than that. Lastly, they are incredibly loyal. If you just look at their social media accounts, they have their people that they follow, and they follow them all the time, and they stay loyal to them. And that is a really big and positive characteristic about this generation. It's like once you have gained their trust, they will stay loyal to you until something happens where that trust is broken, but they will stay loyal as long as it's shown that you are working with them. Now, what does this mean for us as a whole in regards to those who work with these individuals? Part of it is parents are co-pilots. They're not as involved as millennial parents were. They are still involved. Their children are still going to look to them for advice, but they're not going to be the ones typically calling all the time about certain things. Um, they're still parents. They're still going to call when they have questions, but they're not going to be the ones that want to do things for their children as much as the millennial parents were. Part of this too is they have reinforced that need for safety. So that obsession for safety also comes from their parents and has resulted in a what's called a delayed adolescence. Jean Twenge, she wrote this book. It's got a really long title, but it's called iGen: Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and what that means for the rest of us. Basically, what she has done in this book has broken down different things from this generation and compared it to the numbers from the previous four generations. So millennials, baby boomers, Gen X, and the silent generation, and where they were along the same time and what they're doing. And so, but with this delayed adolescence and this need for safety, they have been protected from a lot of adult responsibilities. So they're experiencing a lot of first in college that typically previous generations have been experiencing in high school. This has resulted in reduced social skills. They live a lot of their lives online, and so they have a very keen sense of how to conduct themselves online, but conducting themselves in person and interacting with other people, you will probably see that it's a struggle for them. In Twenge's book in particular, she mentions that it's about compared to other generations, they are interacting with others, like hanging out with friends, going to movies. They're doing that at about 50% less than previous generations. Um, there's also a decrease in reading and critical thinking skills. This is mainly due to kind of No Child Left Behind, and also having instant access to something that's always going to give you an answer, which is your smartphone. And so they have the answers, but they don't necessarily always know what to do with it or how that answer came about. And so that's an area where they need a little bit more help. They're great at gathering information. They can give you all the information in the world of all these different sources and everything, but they have a hard time disseminating what may be fact, what may be is not as much truth, and then what is it that they actually need for their future. They also have shorter attention spans. Right now, most of the research says they have about 8 seconds in an attention span. Some research now, more recent ones, been kind of cutting it down closer to 7. So the attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. Now, it does mean for us that we have to be pretty quick on trying to grab their attention, and trying to grab it quickly. And so it can make us feel like we have to be on the ball all the time. And that's something that can be pretty exhausting for faculty and staff, and having to deal with that a lot. But not always necessarily what that means as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Lastly, they set high expectations for themselves. So this generation is more likely to self-harm than previous generations. And they're also more likely to create fake identities online, mainly to hold up these representations that they have for themselves. So they'll have one account that's for like parents and people that they know need to see certain things that are a little bit, maybe a little bit more professional or hold this one expectation, but then they'll create a fake account for their close friends that they may share other things. And so it's not that they're intentionally being secretive. It's just where their safety feels like they need to be and what expectations they need to show to certain people. Now, I threw this in here just as a little fun fact and how generational theory can actually be really helpful in this. So I'm sure over the past year, you guys have all heard the phrase "okay, boomer." It has been very popular, and it's mainly been a negative term from a younger generation to the older generation about the things they don't like. Um, but sometimes in my field, we hear sometimes that the things that we don't like about other generations or other people, sometimes the things we see in ourselves. And this is kind of true when it comes to baby boomers and Generation Z. They actually do share some characteristics that are um, very helpful to both. They just do it in different ways. And so it's just hard for them to understand the other one. Also, in generational theory, um, every fourth generation mirrors itself. Um, and so Generation Z actually mirrors the silent generation, which is kind of one of the early generations we hear about in a lot of their stuff. It's just a little bit different based on the time and the world they live in. The good thing from that is that a lot of great people came from the silent generation. We have Martin Luther King, Johnny Carson, Andy Warhol, Elvis. So some really big movers and shakers in the world and people who shaped a lot of some of the things we do now when it comes to civil rights and music and art and those kinds of things. They all came from that generation. And so the very same expectation can be set for this generation, and that's part of their goal in it as well. So the things that they share with the boomers is that they are hard workers. They understand, unlike the previous millennial generation, that work's not necessarily always going to be given to them. And that they may have to work a little bit harder to get what they call recession-proof living. And so basically having that stability within themselves. And so they know they're going to have to work. They're not going to go to the extent that baby boomers have gone as a workaholic, but they do know that they have to work and they're not just going to slack. They're also saving for the future. They're very financially conscious, as we said earlier. And so more so than previous generations, they're starting at younger ages to actually save for the future and be mindful of what their retirement's going to look like, when most generations in the past at this age group were not even focused on that. And lastly, they value security and respect. Very much like the boomers, they were trying to create a sense of stability and security when they were dealing with coming back from world wars and Vietnam War and all these other things. They were trying to get this sense of security and respect. Generation Z is doing the same thing, they just do it in a slightly different way. Um, and so they actually have a lot more in common, and I find that the whole okay boomer thing to be highly entertaining because of that fact. So their world views. So we're looking at the educational system first. Basically, the educational system is a chess match. They view the system as a whole as broken, mainly because it has not been able to keep up with the speed of technology. And so it's not that they dislike the educational system, it's just like as a whole, they feel like the system is kind of broken and working against them. They also feel like the system is very bureaucratic, it's not very flexible, it has some very rigid things, and they're not always helpful when finding careers. And after college as well. And so they have a hard time with higher education at times. And lastly, they see the educational system in higher ed in general as a means to an end. So basically, more education means they're going to get the chance to get more money because they're going to get a better job. And that's going to give them more sustainability to have a recession-proof life. Basically, the college degree has replaced the high school diploma. If you want anything more than minimum wage, you're gonna need a college degree. And it's less of a want and more of a necessity. And that's where Generation Z has some qualms with it. Um, and so how this impacts their future. They also see, and kind of this is something we're working against and well with as well, that the weight of student debt. Now, student debt increases, so does the cost of living increase. Student debt is not something that is adjusted at all for the cost of living, like certain benefits would be if you were to retire. And so, like I said, just as other things are increasing, so is student debt. ASU has done a really great job in the past few years of trying to reduce the amount of student debt as much as possible, and that's great. And that's something we're going to be continuing, and we need to continue doing because that's something that's very important to this generation, is having the least amount of debt possible when they graduate. Also, they're dealing with cyclical downgrading. So what that is settling for jobs they wouldn't normally settle for just because they have to. And so what happens with that is that over time, it leads to less earnings, and it's harder for them to gain financial independence. It can set them back anywhere from 10 to 15 years financially. And in regards to what past generations have been able to do at their same time. Um, and then also, like I said, I probably will say this a million times, the impact of the recession is that young people are hurt most by recessions, mainly because of lack of growth in the employment areas during the times of recessions or bad economies in general. And so they're hurting most because there's less opportunities for them to go do things that they need to, but yet there's more students coming in who are getting college degrees, but there's less jobs out there for them to actually do to go after, and it's a lot more of a competitive field than what it used to be. And so it's kind of working against them and us at the same time. All right, so overall, what we're working with in regards to what this looks like in the classroom setting, what this may look like when you have a student worker as well. And these may be some things that you may have noticed with them. First part is they want more independent and hands-on learning. They like self-directed learning. They are not information dump people. So like this presentation probably would not go over very well with a lot of them because it's a lot of information in a short amount of time, and that's not what they view education to be or how they learn best to be. They also like to observe and then try things on their own when it comes to learning certain things. Um, Secondly, they also have a dislike for group work very strongly. Part of that's because of the reduced social skills, but also it's mainly because they want to work independently. They don't really want to be dependent on others for a grade, and also they have a hard time seeing the benefit of certain things when it comes to traditional group work and how it's traditionally done. And we'll talk about a few things in a little bit about how to kind of mix that up a little bit to where you can still do group work because it's very necessary for them, but do it to where they're going to be a little bit more engaged with it. Um, Thirdly, they are focused on the essential knowledge. So this goes back to that having instant resources all the time. They're focused on just knowing what the essential is. And this is where that critical thinking skills are at a deficit a little bit at times, and they just want the essential. They want to know what it is I need to have for this test. They want to know what it is I need to have for this certain career. Like what do I need for this? And they miss out on some of the other things that go with it, but part of it's because they're sifting through so much information in a short amount of time that they just need whatever they need to get through, because they're bombarded with so much more information than previous generations at one time, just because of access to so many resources. Um, Lastly, or not lastly, sorry. Um, these next two kind of go together. Communication may seem unprofessional for them, and they also have a fear to reach out to professors. Some of it's a social skills thing, but part of it too is that they actually really do want one-on-one conversations. Like they want that connection, but due to how things were set up in the educational system in their younger years, it was a little bit harder to do that, and to reach out. And they probably had some negative experiences with that back then too. And so they find it hard to talk to people who they feel like have such authority over them. And then also too, when it comes to communication, they're used to communicating in a much different way than we are. A lot of their communication is very stagnant, almost one-liner-ish. And they also communicate with a lot of visuals. If any of you have younger children who text or have teenagers and those kinds of things, you can see if you ever looked at their phone, you may not understand half the stuff that's on the phone because they're communicating in what almost seems like a completely different language. Sometimes. And that could come across when they're first coming to college and those kind of things because they have a hard time separating those two worlds. They know they need to do something different and they know they need to be a little bit more professional, but they don't really know how to do that. And then they also don't see anything wrong with emailing at all hours of the day either because they have access to communication and a means of doing that at all hours a day. So to them, it doesn't really quite make sense as to why we're stuck to the traditional 8 to 5 realm because for them, their world is so much more than that. And so there is some learning and some teaching that needs to come with that. The last two, perfectionism and a need for immediacy, are two things that kind of go hand in hand. Perfectionism goes back to that setting high standards for themselves. It comes across in grades, it comes across in work ethic, and it comes across in how they present themselves. And so this generation is more prone to burnout because of these expectations. But it kind of is a two-edged sword because they want also really immediate results at the same time, but also at probably some unrealistic standards and expectations. And so there is this kind of back and forth that they have with themselves a lot. And so this shows up in the classroom with maybe wanting that really immediate response to an email, even though it may be after hours, or they may have emailed you within hours, but you have other things that you have going on and you didn't respond immediately, and that upsets them. And so there's a little bit. This is also that delayed adolescence portion of things too, where we're dealing with some of these behaviors, for lack of a better term, that would have been um, dealt with in high school, and they just aren't getting to that portion of things yet. So, what are some things we can do to help with that? First one is mixing it up. Now, like I said, this generation does not do well with like traditional lecture formatting a lot of time because they don't like the information dump. They also, the research did show like using flipped classrooms has been helpful, but it's not a flipped classroom so much as like they are teaching themselves because they don't view that very well because then that financial aspect comes into play and they're like, well, what am I paying to go to college if I'm going to teach myself anyways? Like I can just watch YouTube videos on this and teach myself and not have to pay all this money to go to school to have someone not teach me what I'm going to do. And the same thing goes for work as well. And so if you're teaching a certain skill for your job and what they're doing, you might have to mix it up in the sense of how you would traditionally maybe teach something. So all day long trainings for some students is going to be really difficult. Maybe necessity, but you're going to have to maybe break it up to what you would normally do. Also integrating visuals and video is going to be something that's really helpful. I think that's something that a lot of you guys already do. Um, and so it's just about finding that balance with that group of students. And I know that's going to be really frustrating because that means almost every semester it's going to change. And so you may have to alter things a little bit more frequently than you normally would. Um, and then since I am not in the educational world, it listed a whole bunch of different types of models to use that I am not familiar with, so I did not feel comfortable going over them all. But basically, they fall into two categories, which is logic-based and experiential approaches. So it makes a lot of sense with the experiential approaches. They're hands-on learners. They learn by observing. So the more activities that you can involve in your classes or how you would teach something to a student worker is something that's going to help them more versus just maybe giving them a list of things to do instead. Also, they're very logic based as well. And so they're going to be able to follow logic versus more than like if you were just to tell them, well, imagine you were doing this. They have a really difficult time with that, not because they don't have the ability to imagine things and they're not creative. It's just not something that they are used to doing. And so it is more difficult for them to do that. And it also kind of goes against that realistic and like almost pragmatic side of them. That's where you're like, well, why would I imagine something if there's a real life scenario that I can just base this off of right now? So, like, how's that going to help me if I'm going to imagine things? And so, that's some of the things we get in our offices a lot here, and when we try to use imaginary work sometimes. Um, but the last three all kind of, or actually the last two and three, kind of all work with each other. Storytelling, using real life scenarios is a really big thing for them, or giving visuals for them so they have something to connect concepts with is something that's really going to help them. It's going to help them with recall. It may not necessarily help them all with understanding. Um, in as much detail, but it's going to help them recall the information faster because that's just what they're used to communicating and looking at. And so they're used to that visual portion of things. Also, the connectivity portion of it. When we look at the career stuff, we'll go over the boss portion of things. But when it talks to like faculty and stuff, um, they are going to be more motivated to work with you and to work in the class if you're also motivated to work with them and are motivated about your topic. If you're not motivated whatsoever about your topic and you voice that, they're going to be less likely to want to engage in doing that because if they see that if you're not wanting to do it, why should I want to do it? Also too, that connection with the student, that emotional connection in the sense of being able to work with them, maybe adapting some things on a teaching style or understanding like, okay, everyone seemed to miss this section. Let's try to redo this in a different way. Um, Doing that with them is going to make them more likely to stick with you versus not. And so that can almost make up for bad teaching in their eyes. Lastly, they're going to want/require more feedback um, than previous generations. And so giving them as much feedback, whether it's positive or constructive criticism as well, either way, they just need more feedback because, like I said, they're in this delayed adolescence. So they are still figuring things out, but yet thrown into this adult world where they have little to no backup experience on how to do some of these things. And so they need more feedback of like what they're doing, how they're doing it. They're probably you're probably going to see them ask more questions about this, things too, wanting that feedback because they do want to succeed. It is a big portion of them. They want to succeed. They want to get to their goals, but they just need our help along the way with it. Now looking into the career stuff. Now what they want in a career um, is interesting and is slightly different than previous generations. They want a work-life balance, but it's a work-life balance that is more than just I want to be able to work and have a life. They want to work that has a work that has a purpose, and they want to be able to balance the life aspects of things more so than just having a social life. So this is, like I said earlier, this is where they differ from the baby boomer generation, where they are not workaholics. They'll work really, really hard and they will try their best to do everything that they can, but they need that balance from things. Um, they also want jobs and careers that are going to have advancement opportunities. So, ability to move up the ladder is something they're looking at. This goes back to that kind of recession proofing of their careers and what they look at. They want something that they can move up in. They also want a boss who's going to be a leader, someone they can look up to, and someone who is ethical. It kind of goes with that transparent communication thing. They want someone who's going to represent them. They want authenticity. That is what they crave. Sometimes when it comes to leaders and when they see aspects of inauthenticity, they tend to shut down from that. Flexibility is another big thing for them, and it's not just flexibility when it comes to work-life balance. There is a portion of that. They are looking into gig economy, which is where it's more freelance, or the 1099 economy. They are understanding that that's a way they can still work but keep the life balance of things that they need to do because it's on their schedule and not necessarily a traditional 8 to 5 kind of thing. But it's also flexibility in where they work. Most of them are not going to be geared towards wanting to work in an office space, like I said, from 8 to 5. They kind of want that flexibility of being able to potentially work from home at times when they need to and come in at the office at other times. And so um, a lot of companies are starting to notice that with this generation, and so they're trying to work towards having that ability to be a little bit more flexible. Um, they also want to make that social impact, that social justice portion is coming back into play. One of the research articles said 60% of the Generation Z students that they interviewed wanted to have a job that had a social impact. So, I mean, this is a big portion of this generation. They also want something that's going to integrate technology. They have seen the growth of technology throughout their lives and have experienced it firsthand. And they're also big thinkers and believers that artificial intelligence is going to make a big, um, impact on the world in the next couple of decades. And they want to be a part of that. And they want to help that move along. So what are some things that we can do to help? We can provide leadership training for them. A lot of them want to be leaders, but they may lack some of the skill set. And so sometimes just throwing them into the leadership work, like description is going to be a little bit hard. So any student organization or program that provides leadership training is something that they're going to be drawn to. They're also going to want recognition for the work, going back to that need for feedback. They're also going to want to work on smaller teams. They're doing a lot of research when it comes to careers and the fields they're looking into, and they're looking, they understand the importance of big companies, but they prefer the working environment of smaller companies and smaller teams. With this generation too, volunteer opportunities look different. It's not volunteerism just to volunteer. They want to volunteer because of the social impact. They want to have a volunteer opportunity that focuses on the symptoms of the problem, not just to put it on the resume kind of thing. They don't see the benefit in it. They understand the benefit of it, but they don't like it. Then lastly, they want to be able to be open to communicate with various technologies. So um, like if your department mainly wants them to call on the phone, they want to be to schedule an appointment. They're going to want a little bit more openness than that because they're used to texting and those kind of things. And so they're going to probably go through email and they're going to continue to try to push that boundary a little bit until there's some kind of, I guess, not a falling into, but some kind of compromise with that and being able to communicate with people in different forms of technology. We're not saying you need to go make TikToks to tell them about work, but it is something that that they are exploring more, and they want companies that are going to be open to doing those kinds of things. So what can colleges do? First thing is being more flexible. One of those things could be creating their own major um, and tailoring the major to what they want to do in the field. I know it's a really hard thing to do, not something that's going to change overnight, but this is what a lot of students are looking at. This is also even starting even at the application process to where they're wanting to see about, instead of maybe doing an essay, they want to submit a video instead. There's a college in Baltimore that is doing video submissions instead. They want online applications, which I know we already do, but they want that accessibility with technology. They also want the choice in how they take their classes. So I know we already offer the hybrid model right now of being able to do in-person or online classes, but this is something that you're going to see more of a trend on and probably more of a push in integrating technology and how we're offering classes as a whole. Um, Secondly is career services. So like I said, they know coming to college equals a better career. And so they want career services integrated into the classroom. We have a career development area and it's great and they work really well with the students, but they want it everywhere. They want it in the classroom. They want to know that their classes are going to help them in their careers in the future. They also want internships. They want that experience they may not be able to get because they don't have the work credentials to actually get in the door, but they need that on the job, hands-on learning and internships. Another thing colleges can do is looking at tailoring programs for certifications. There's a lot of times, and these students and companies know that majors are only the same in title alike. They have different classes depending on which state and which college you go to. And so a lot of careers are looking at people having credentials and certain certifications versus just taking certain classes and knowing not all classes are going to line up with certain certifications. And so if that's something we want to offer, that would be a really good thing and a really good help for these generations, these students, and another big push for them to come to college versus just going to work on a job and getting the certifications on their own. Thirdly, we have Social justice, like I said, it's everywhere in here. One of the things they want colleges to do is they want to address inclusion and equity concerns within your administration as a whole. And so they're looking at colleges not just because of the financial aspect, but they're also looking at colleges and what student life is like, what I guess reviews, for lack of a better term, are coming on from other students' experiences when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion of people who are different. Um, and people who may need a little extra help with those things. And that is something that they want universities to address more. And they want them to address it in a transparent way. This is a really big thing for them. They want open communication as much as they can. They would also love to be a part of the conversation too. Like I said, this is a part of the hallmark of their generation. They want to make that social impact, and if they can make that at the college level by having their voices heard about things about inclusion and those kinds of things, that is going to be a really big driving factor for them, including them wanting to stay in colleges longer outside of just knowing they need to do it because they have to do it for their career. Lastly is support services. As I said before, they're experiencing a lot of their first here on campus. So they're having their first job. They may be driving for the first time on their own. They're living on their own for the very first time, even for an extended time. These are their first experiences with romantic relationships, drugs and alcohol sometimes too. And so they need all the support services they can to help them through this time. They also want you to address safety concerns. This is not just their personal safety. This is their safety as online as well. So they want to make sure that their data is secure and that their personal safety is cared for as well. They also want intentional spaces. So some colleges are doing what's called maker spaces, which is where a space where students can create things, be creative, but also relieve stress, and then have a place that's dedicated just to doing that. I know we have spaces on here on campus that are dedicated to studying and those kind of things too, but you're going to see a little bit more push from this generation coming up about having intentional spaces for very specific things outside of just academics. So looking at what is COVID's impact on this? What did COVID and the global pandemic take away from this generation? It took away control of their learning environment. Everything had to go online. Right now, they do have a choice, but still much more restricted than what it used to be. They've also potentially lost multiple years of wage growth. Like I said earlier, young people who enter the career world during a bad economy lose almost 10 to 15 years of the ability to earn stable wages or to gain financial independence. And they are knowledgeable of this, and a lot of them are scared about going to work or considering even working before college because they feel like they need to get some experience years because of the economy. Um, we talked about insecure data a little bit, how they really care about their data security. With everything going online, it put a lot more things at risk for being hacked and potentially having their security and privacy broken. And so they are very cautious of this. It's also had them lose opportunities to interact with professionals. So a lot of them lost their internship opportunities and their ability to even do an internship in the future because of the pandemic. So they're already losing that little bit of experience they would have gained in those on the job learning skills. Then lastly, social interactions. They were already delayed in this and struggling with these on their own, but now we're adding in the factor that potential social interactions may equal an increased risk of me having COVID or contracting COVID-19. And so it makes them question a lot more about whether or not they actually want to interact with other people when we know they need to at times, but it makes them a lot more hesitant to actually do it. So what can we do? One of them, the flexibility thing. I can't say it enough. I can't stress it enough. I'm not saying you need to bend over backwards for them or anything, but being flexible with them and they're also going to be try to be as flexible as they can with you too, because they know that this is stressful and this is different for everyone and everyone's kind of going through this together. um, but they're dealing with so many differences in such a different way, that and lacking some of the skills to possibly do that, is really putting them at a deficit at times. They also need interaction time without screens. Since everything went online, some of them really thrived at the beginning, but they noticed towards the end that screens were not as appealing as they used to be, and they actually wanted time away from them, and they actually do need that. If any of you have young children, and during the summer, you guys probably realized and saw that like phones were not as important as they used to be towards like midsummer because they they were tired of phones. They were like, I'm tired of online stuff. I want to interact with people. They really do want those social interactions, and they just struggle getting to that point sometimes. Lastly is resiliency training and coaching. We do need to kind of coach them through this. We do need to remind them that that A, that we're all doing this together, and B, that they are building skills that are going to help them later on, and in what ways we can impact, um, and what ways this is going to impact their future. So, in summary, um, I have this quote that pretty much summarizes everything, and this is from different professors' points of view when it comes to teaching Generation Z. And so it says, we must dismantle their isolation by normalizing their experiences, justifying their commitment, acknowledging their struggles, and creating spaces for them to fail safely. Value their time, avoid assumptions, and don't waste their money. Avoid busy work by developing activities and lecture points related to their majors or real world scenarios. Set up open access text or put the required reading on reserve in the library. Use group work not only to ensure participation, but also to aid in cultivating of friendships and the sharing of advice. Create assignments and dialogues that reduce risk aversion. So that basically just summarizes this whole information dump um, webinar that we had in a nice little um, paragraph there. Um, and that's basically it. These are all my references. Um, and so I'm going to close this portion out of things to make the screen a little bit easier to work with. If you guys have any questions, please type them into the chat box. If you don't feel like asking them in the chat box, you can always email me. That is my email there at curie.via@angelo.edu. If you want to learn more about counseling services, you can look at our website at angelo.edu/counseling. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and um, then we can go through all the questions.